The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the ordinary kind, the kind you get when men are tired, when a room simply runs out of words. This was a deliberate quiet, a practiced silence that had been placed over everything like a lid, pressed down with both hands until even the smallest sound felt dangerous. Someone had closed a door somewhere down the corridor. It didn't slam. It didn't even click the way it should. It made a soft, careful sound, as if the person on the other side had decided the noise mattered, as if the noise could change what was about to happen. The air held that stale warmth you get when too many bodies have been in one place too long, when breath and wool and damp leather begin to mix into something sour. It sat in my throat. I swallowed once and felt it scrape down like grit. No one offered water. No one moved toward the stove. No one asked if anyone needed any. Comfort had been postponed, maybe canceled. In front of me, a man's hands rested on the edge of a table. His fingers were spread, then slowly pulled in, then spread again. An unconscious motion, like he was testing whether his own hand still belonged to him. Another man stood with his back half-turned, not fully facing the room, not fully facing away. He stared at something on the wall that wasn't meant to be stared at for that long. He blinked too rarely. The clock was there, somewhere. I could feel it more than I could hear it. Each second didn't pass. It gathered. It stacked up, one on top of another, as if time itself had decided to become weight. There were papers, but no one reached for them. There were maps, but no one traced lines. The usual rituals, the rehearsed gestures that made difficult work feel normal, had vanished. They'd been replaced by stillness, by watching, by waiting for a sentence that would make the rest of the day irreversible. A chair creaked under someone shifting their balance. The sound cut through the room so sharply that I saw two heads turn toward it at the same time, like animals flinching at a twig snap. The man in the chair froze mid-motion, as if he'd been caught doing something wrong. I kept my eyes where they belonged. Down, slightly forward, never challenging, never questioning. I knew my place well enough that I could feel it like a collar against my skin. And yet I couldn't stop noticing the small thing, the way certain men didn't look at each other, even when speaking, the way the room seemed arranged not for discussion, but for confirmation, the way breath was held when someone approached the table, and released only after they stepped back again. It wasn't fear in the obvious sense. Not the fear of being shot at, or the fear of an immediate threat outside the walls. It was something colder, a fear of being the one who said the wrong thing, a fear of being the one who hesitated, a fear of admitting, even silently, that there might be a choice. Because when people admit there is a choice, they also admit they are responsible for the one they make. Someone cleared their throat, then thought better of it, and swallowed the sound before it became real. A hand reached toward a pencil, hovered, and withdrew. The pencil stayed where it was, untouched, like it had become evidence. I stood where I'd been told to stand, close enough to hear, close enough to see, close enough that later, if anyone ever asked, I could say I was present. But present is not the same as included. The room had a center, an empty space where words were supposed to land, where a decision would be placed, heavy as metal, and everyone would pretend it had always been there. Everyone would adjust their posture around it. Everyone would accept it, because to do otherwise would mean acknowledging what it cost. I watched their faces, tight mouths, eyes that stayed dry, jaws that moved as if chewing something bitter. I watched the way one man's boot tapped once, then stopped, as if even nervousness had been ordered to stand down. And the strangest part was this. The longer the silence lasted, the more certain I became that the decision had already been made, not spoken yet, not written down, not given a shape anyone could point to. But it was already moving through the room, invisible and unstoppable, like smoke creeping under a door. Then someone shifted forward, and the air changed, subtle, immediate, like the room had finally decided to inhale. And in that inhalation, I understood something I wasn't supposed to understand. Whatever was about to be said would not need agreement. It would only need to be heard. When the light finally came, it came thin and colorless, like it had been filtered through fatigue. It was the kind of morning that made everything look temporary. Canvas, timber, faces, even the breath that rose from men's mouths in short, controlled clouds. The air had a metallic bite to it, not quite frost, not quite smoke, but something that lived between them. Somewhere nearby, a generator coughed itself awake, then settled into a steady, irritated hum. It made the walls feel less like protection and more like paper. We were not in a city. Not anymore. The place we had moved into had the feel of a forward station. Built quickly, used hard, never meant to be remembered. The buildings were low and utilitarian. The ground was packed into a kind of permanent mud that had forgotten what dry soil felt like. Boots had beaten it flat. Vehicle tires had carved it into ruts that filled with water and stayed that way. There were signs of winter, but not the clean kind. Snow tried to gather at the edges of paths and was immediately crushed into gray slush. Ice formed in shallow pans and was shattered by careless steps. The wind found every gap in every doorframe, every seam in every coat. Inside, everything smelled of damp cloth and old smoke, and the sharp tang of cleaning solution that never quite erased what had been there before. Kerosene lamps, cigarette ash, the bitter residue of coffee boiled too long, paper, ink, metal, a faint trace of sweat that stayed trapped in wool. The routines were rigid, not because anyone loved order, but because order kept the mind from drifting into questions. Men woke, dressed, ate without tasting. Radios were checked, lines were tested, vehicles were fueled. Documents were moved from one hand to another, stamped, initialed, placed into folders that were always too thin for what they carried. Everyone spoke in short bursts, as if long sentences could be overheard by the wrong part of the world. I had a job that put me close enough to hear things that weren't meant for me, and far enough away that no one ever asked what I thought about them. I was not the one who decided anything. I was not the one whose name would be written in the clean, official ink at the bottom of orders. I was a pair of hands for small tasks, a set of eyes for small details, a body that could be moved where needed without explanation, a runner, a clerk, sometimes an assistant, sometimes simply the person standing behind the person who mattered, holding a folder, holding a coat, holding silence. It sounds simple when you say it like that, but being close to power has a gravity. It pulls at you. It changes the way you breathe. It teaches you which footsteps in a corridor mean nothing, and which mean the air should be cleared. It teaches you to recognize a mood before a word is spoken. There was a hierarchy so visible you could taste it. Certain men moved through the compound as if space belonged to them. Their coats were better fitted. Their gloves were cleaner. Their expressions were practiced, controlled, unreadable. When they spoke, even quietly, others leaned in without meaning. When they paused, everyone else paused too, like time waited for their permission. Lower down, men kept their eyes busy. They found reasons to adjust straps, to check locks, to wipe lenses that were already clear. It wasn't just discipline, it was survival. You survived by not being noticed at the wrong moment. And there were moments, small, sharp moments, when the whole place seemed to tighten around something unseen. Like the day before, when an officer I didn't recognize arrived in a vehicle that had been washed cleaner than anything else around it. He stepped out and didn't look at the mud. He didn't look at the men who rushed to open the door. He walked straight toward the command building with a folder held close to his chest, as if it contained heat. Or the way the radios had gone quieter, not in volume but in tone. Fewer jokes, fewer pointless exchanges. Even the static sounded tense, as if the air itself was listening. Or the way a map that had been pinned on the wall for days suddenly disappeared overnight, replaced by a new one with fewer markings, simpler, cleaner. The kind of map that didn't show obstacles, only destinations. No one explained the change. Explanation was not part of the culture. We were trained into a world where knowledge traveled downward like a controlled drip, measured and rationed. If you were given a detail, it was because someone above you had decided you could carry it without spilling. But I carried more than they intended. Not because anyone trusted me, but because my job placed me in doorways, in corners, beside tables where conversations began before they noticed I was there, and continued because stopping would draw attention. I learned to read the space between words. When men spoke about timing, they meant permission. When they spoke about weather, they meant readiness. When they spoke about clarity, they meant commitment. And when they spoke about necessity, they meant something that would not be questioned without consequences. There were papers that came through my hands that I wasn't supposed to read. I never read them fully, not on purpose. But you don't need to read something fully to absorb its shape. You see a phrase, a number, a time, a signature that appears more than once in a short span. You see the way a document is handled, carefully, reverently, as if it might bite. I began to notice which envelopes were sealed twice. I began to notice which folders were carried by men who didn't normally carry anything. And I began to notice most of all, the way certain people stopped speaking when they heard footsteps. Not all footsteps, only certain ones. There were nights when the building stayed lit past the usual hour, the glow leaking out through cracks in the shutters like something alive. I would pass by on errands and hear voices inside, low, compressed, drained of warmth. Sometimes I caught a name, not a person's name, a place. A line of sound that meant a location, a point on a map, a direction. Once, late, I saw a man step outside and stand alone in the cold. He didn't smoke. He didn't stretch. He just stood there, staring at the dark like he expected it to answer him. When he finally moved, he rubbed his face with both hands hard enough to leave red marks on his cheeks, then went back inside without looking around. In the mess hall, conversation changed too. Men still talked about food, about letters from home, about how someone had gotten their boots wet again. But there was a layer underneath it now, a carefulness, a habit of stopping mid-sentence when someone new entered, a habit of laughing half a second too late, as if the body remembered how laughter worked but didn't fully believe it anymore. One morning, someone at my table mentioned a rumor. Nothing direct, just the kind of vague mention that floated through camps like dust. A change coming, a big move, something decided up top. He said it casually, as if testing whether the words could sit on his tongue without burning. No one responded. Forks scraped plates. Someone drank coffee that had gone cold. The rumor died in the space between us, unacknowledged but not dismissed. That's how things lived here, not spoken, but present. By the time that particular day began, the day that would later refuse to leave my mind, I had already felt it circling for days. Not as a clear thought, but as a pressure. Like being underwater, like a deep ache behind the eyes. My tasks kept me moving, delivering messages, carrying equipment, waiting outside rooms I wasn't allowed in, bringing in documents to be stamped, handed back without comment. It was all ordinary work, but ordinary work can become terrifying when you sense it is a surface stretched tight over something enormous. Late morning, a runner came to me and spoke my name in a tone that meant it wasn't a request. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. I followed him through the compound. The wind had picked up. It pushed at us like a hand, impatient. Somewhere a vehicle engine started and idled, heavy and steady, as if it had been told to be ready and refused to do anything else until commanded. We approached the building with the shutters, the one that stayed lit too long at night, the one whose door seemed to absorb sound when it closed. A guard stood at the entrance. He checked the runner's face, then mine, then stepped aside without changing expression. Inside, the air was warmer but heavier, thick with the smell of bodies and paper, and something faintly chemical, fresh ink or damp cloth drying too close to a stove. We moved down the corridor. The floorboards creaked in places where they always creak, but here even familiar sounds felt like trespass. At the end of the hall was a door that was closed. Not just shut, closed with intention. The runner stopped. He nodded once toward me, then left without another word, as if his part in this had ended and mine had begun. I stood there for a moment with a folder in my hands that I hadn't been carrying 5 minutes earlier. I don't remember picking it up. I only remember the weight of it, and the fact that my fingers were sweating against the paper. From behind the door came nothing no voices, no movement, just the faintest suggestion of presence, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it. Someone inside shifting their chair, a soft scrape against wood, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that makes the stomach drop, that whatever was happening in that room was not a discussion. It was preparation. I took my place along the wall, where I was expected to be invisible. The room was fuller now, not crowded. Nothing here ever felt chaotic, but occupied in a way that changed the air. Chairs were closer together than usual. Coats hung untouched on hooks despite the warmth. A few men stood instead of sitting, not out of respect, but because sitting would have felt like settling into something too permanent. No one acknowledged me. That was correct. I existed only as function, a presence without weight. The door closed behind the last arrival, and with it came a subtle shift, a tightening, almost imperceptible, like a muscle flexing under skin. The outside world was cut off. Whatever happened next would happen without witnesses who could leave. At first, there was talk. Not much, and not loudly. Short exchanges that sounded like confirmation rather than conversation. A question asked with the expectation of a specific answer. A reply given carefully, trimmed of anything unnecessary. I noticed how often sentences trailed off before they reached their natural end. A man would begin to say something, then stop, as if he had seen the thought from the outside and decided it didn't belong in the room. Another would finish the sentence, not aloud, but with a nod or a shift in posture that said, "I know what you mean. We all know what you..." There were pauses that lasted just a second too long. Not long enough to demand attention, but long enough to make the silence feel intentional, loaded. Someone mentioned a timetable, not in numbers, just a phrase. Before the window closes. No one asked what window. No one asked what would happen after. Another man responded by saying nothing at all, only pressing his lips together and exhaling through his nose, slow and controlled. It was agreement without enthusiasm, acceptance without comfort. I began to feel something tightening in my chest, a sensation I recognized but couldn't name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anticipation. It was closer to recognition. The moment when you realize you've seen this shape before. Even if the details are, the maps were finally touched, not spread out, not studied, just indicated. A finger rested on a section briefly, then moved away, as if lingering might make the implication too clear. There were references to resources, to readiness, to what could be sustained and what could not. The words were neutral, administrative, scrubbed of emotion. But beneath them ran a current I couldn't ignore. Everything was being framed as alignment, as if the greatest danger wasn't the decision itself, but the possibility that not everyone would move in the same direction once it was made. I watched faces as people spoke, not the mouths, the eyes. Some avoided contact altogether, fixing their gaze on the table, the wall, the edge of a document. Others looked directly at whoever was speaking, too directly, as if daring them to say something wrong. There was one man near the center of the room who barely spoke at all. When he did, it was brief and precise, and the effect was immediate. Conversations adjusted around his words. Others filled in the space he left, expanding on his meaning without ever contradicting it. Power, I had learned, did not announce itself. It rearranged the room. I shifted my weight slightly, careful not to make a sound. My shoulder brushed the wall, and the cold of it bled through the fabric of my coat. I welcomed the sensation. It kept me anchored, because inside my head, things were beginning to move too quickly. I started noticing contradictions. Not open ones, not anything that could be challenged outright, but small fractures in the way things were being described. A reference to readiness that didn't match what I had seen that morning. An assumption about timing that ignored delays I knew were real. No one else seemed troubled by these gaps. Or if they were, they hid it well. I told myself it wasn't my place to notice, that I lacked the full picture, that there were layers above me I would never see, considerations I couldn't possibly understand. But the unease didn't fade. It sharpened. Someone laughed quietly at something said in passing. It was a short sound, almost reflexive, and it died immediately when no one joined in. The man who laughed cleared his throat and folded his hands, embarrassed, as if he had broken an unspoken rule. From that moment on, the room felt narrower. Voices lowered further. Chairs stopped shifting. Even breathing seemed synchronized, shallow and careful, as though the group had unconsciously decided that too much oxygen might complicate. I became acutely aware of my own breath, of the way my chest rose and fell. I worried, irrationally, that someone might notice. At one point, a question was asked that should have slowed everything down. It was phrased politely, indirectly. A request for clarification about an assumption that had been made earlier, the kind of question that, in another context, would have been praised for thoroughness. The response came quickly, too quickly. A reassurance delivered in a tone that discouraged follow-up. Not sharp, not angry, but firm in a way that closed doors. The questioner nodded and did not speak again. I felt something settle then, a kind of internal This was not a space where doubts were explored. This was a space where doubts were absorbed and neutralized. The realization made my mouth go dry. I thought about all the small tasks I had done that week. The messages carried, the equipment moved, the quiet instructions followed without question. At the time, each action had felt isolated, harmless on its own. Now, in the shape of this room, they began to connect. Not into a clear picture, nothing so generous, but into a direction. Forward, unstoppable. I looked at the door, just for a second. Not because I intended to leave, but because some part of me wanted to confirm it still existed. It stood there, solid and closed, guarded on the other side. No exit without permission. The talk continued, but it no longer felt like exploration. It felt like convergence. Different threads tightening toward a single point. I realized, with a kind of hollow calm, that I understood what was forming before most of the men in the room seemed to. Not the specifics, not the outcome in detail, but the nature of it. This was not a decision born of urgency or panic. It was worse than that. It was a decision that had been allowed to ripen, considered long enough that it now felt reasonable, necessary, almost dull. That was the most frightening part. No raised voices, no visible struggle, no dramatic opposition to overcome. Just men adjusting themselves to the weight of something they had already accepted. I felt the urge to speak rise in me, not as a coherent thought, not even as words, but as pressure. A physical sensation behind my ribs. It passed. Because I knew, as clearly as I had ever known anything, that there was nothing I could say that would change the direction the room was already moving. And I knew something else too. When the moment finally came, when the words were spoken aloud, they would sound simple, and everyone else would hear them as the natural conclusion of a process. Everyone except me. I would hear them as confirmation of something I had been watching approach for days, slowly, silently, without anyone asking me what I saw. No one announced the moment. There was no signal, no clearing of the throat to mark the shift. The room simply reached a point where continuing to circle the subject became unnecessary. The air felt heavier, as if it had finally decided where to settle. A chair scraped softly as one man adjusted his position, angling himself toward the center of the table. The movement drew attention without demanding it. Others followed, not turning fully, not dramatically, but enough to acknowledge where the weight of the room had moved. The voice, when it came, was calm, not loud, not rehearsed. It carried the steadiness of someone who had already spoken these words before, perhaps not aloud, but often enough in his own mind that they had lost their sharp edges. The sentence was short, carefully shaped. It did not describe what would happen in vivid terms. It did not dwell on outcome. It stated intention, framed as necessity, wrapped in language that suggested inevitability rather than choice. As the words crossed the room, something in me went still, not tense, empty. I watched faces as the sentence landed. No one reacted immediately. There was a pause that felt measured, respectful, as if even silence needed to acknowledge the authority of what had just been said. One man nodded once. Another pressed his lips together and looked down at the table. Someone farther back exhaled slowly through his nose, the sound barely audible. These were not signs of agreement so much as signs of submission to momentum. No one asked for clarification. No one requested alternatives. No one said, "Are we certain?" The decision did not arrive with force. It arrived with permission. A second voice followed, not to challenge, but to reinforce. It repeated part of the original sentence in different words, smoothing it, making it easier to hold. A third voice added a practical note, something logistical, something that implied the matter was already moving from thought to action. And just like that, the room changed shape. What had been possibility hardened into direction. What had been tension flattened into procedure. Men shifted in their chairs, not nervously now, but purposefully, like people preparing to stand after a long meeting. I felt my hands go cold, not numb, precise. I realized I was gripping the folder too tightly and loosened my fingers by degrees, careful not to draw attention. The paper inside felt heavier than before, as if it had absorbed the words spoken moments earlier. There was a silence after the last voice finished. Not an awkward one, a reverent one, the kind of silence that follows something final. In that quiet, I became acutely aware of details that had nothing to do with the decision itself. The faint ticking of the clock, the hum of power somewhere in the walls, the sound of fabric shifting as someone crossed one leg over the other. Life, continuing. I wondered briefly if anyone else felt what I felt, that subtle internal drop, like stepping off a curb you thought was closer than it was. I searched faces for signs of it. I found none. What I saw instead were expressions settling into place. Professional, controlled, almost relieved. The uncertainty was over. That alone was comfort. A man near the end of the table glanced at another and gave a small, resigned smile. It was the kind of look exchanged between people who know they will never speak honestly about this again. Someone reached for a pen. The sound of it clicking open was impossibly loud. Ink touched paper, not the main document, something smaller, supplementary, a note perhaps. A marker that said this moment had occurred, that it could be referenced later without being relived. I stood perfectly still. The instinct to disappear had never been stronger. I felt like a shadow cast by something solid and terrible, present only because the object existed, unavoidable as long as the light stayed where it was. There was no invitation for comment. None was expected. The men who mattered had spoken. The rest of us were there to carry the weight forward, piece by piece, without ever acknowledging its source. Someone said, "That settles it." The phrase was delivered gently, almost kindly, and that, more than anything else, told me how irreversible this was, because nothing truly settled ever needed to be said aloud. Chairs moved back, papers were gathered, instructions began to flow, not about the decision itself, but about what came next. Who would go where? What would be needed? When certain things would be ready? The machine had engaged. I felt strangely detached, as if I were watching myself from a distance. I noted how my breathing stayed even, how my face remained neutral, how my body performed exactly as it had been trained to perform. Inside, something folded in on itself. Not guilt, not yet, just understanding. The kind that arrives too early to be useful, and too late to be ignored. As the room began to empty, I realized that the silence I had felt at the beginning had not been anticipation at all. It had been mourning, and now, with the words spoken and accepted, there was nothing left to mourn, only to proceed. I followed when motion around me required it, stepping back into the corridor as the door opened and swallowed the sound behind us. The outside air rushed in, cold and sharp, startling in its normalcy. The world had not changed, but I knew that somewhere beyond these walls, it already had. The effects did not announce themselves. There was no single sound, no clear image that could be pointed to and named as consequent. What followed the decision unfolded the way cold spreads through water, quietly, evenly, impossible to stop once it begins. The corridor outside the room felt narrower than before. Not physically, nothing had moved, but perceptually, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. Men stepped aside to let others pass without exchanging looks. The usual murmurs that filled shared spaces were gone. Orders were given in low voices, stripped of excess language. Replies came quickly, no questions. I walked with the others, my pace matching theirs because it had to. The folder in my hands was no longer just paper. It had become instruction, momentum, proof that something irreversible had crossed from thought into motion. Outside, the compound was alive with activity that looked ordinary to anyone who didn't know what to look for. Engines started and stopped. A vehicle was repositioned by a few meters. Radios crackled briefly, then went quiet. Men checked equipment they had already checked once that morning. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would stand out in memory on its own. But I noticed what wasn't happening. No one lingered. No one argued over details. No one joked to fill the space. Movements were efficient, purposeful, and faintly misaligned, like a body performing a familiar task while thinking about something else entirely. It was the look of people who had accepted direction, but not yet absorbed meaning. I was sent from one building to another with documents that required signatures. The walk should have taken a few minutes. It felt longer. Every step pressed the realization deeper into me that these papers were now part of a chain that could not be broken without someone deliberately shattering it. At one stop, I waited while a man read the page I had brought him. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slowed. He read the same line twice. When he looked up at me, his expression was neutral, but something in his gaze tightened. He didn't ask anything. He signed. The pen made a short, decisive sound against the paper, and that was it. He handed the folder back as if it were no heavier than when it arrived. I moved on. The day continued to rearrange itself around the decision. Schedules shifted without explanation. A meal was delayed. A group that should have rotated out remained where they were. A message arrived over the radio, coded enough that only tone mattered, and the tone was clipped, controlled, final. I watched men receive information and store it behind their eyes without reacting. Training does that. It teaches the body to remain functional even when the mind has not caught up. But not everyone hit it well. Near one of the vehicles, I saw a man standing still while others worked around him. He wasn't blocking any. He wasn't in the way. He simply wasn't moving. His helmet was under his arm, his head slightly bowed, as if listening for something that wasn't there. When someone spoke his name, he startled, actually startled, and blinked as if waking from sleep. He forced a nod. "I'm ready," he said. He wasn't talking about equipment. Later, as I crossed the yard again, I heard raised voices from behind a closed door. Not shouting, not anger, stress leaking through restraint. The kind of exchange that happens when someone realizes the implications of what they have agreed to and searches, too late, for space to renegotiate. The voices dropped suddenly. The door opened a moment later. Two men emerged, faces composed, eyes forward. Whatever had been said inside stayed there. The sky remained flat and pale, offering no drama, no visual confirmation that anything significant had occurred. That somehow made it worse. There was no external marker to match the internal shift. Time passed in fragments. A vehicle rolled out through the gate, then another. I didn't know where they were going. I didn't need to. Direction was no longer abstract. A radio operator adjusted his headset and listened longer than necessary before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but his free hand clenched briefly at his side. I delivered one final message just before dusk. The man who received it read quickly, then folded the paper once, carefully, as if creasing it might help contain what it represented. He slipped it into his coat and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. "Anything else?" he asked. I shook my head. He nodded, dismissed me, then remained where he was long after I had turned away. As the light faded, the compound took on a different character. Shadows stretched. Sounds carried farther. The cold sharpened. Lanterns were lit, casting uneven circles that left faces half seen, half lost. That was when the first real sign reached me, not through sight or sound, but through absence. A name I expected to hear over the radio wasn't spoken. A confirmation that should have come did not. No alarm followed. No immediate reaction. Just a pause that lengthened beyond what was normal. I watched the radio operator glance up, frown slightly, then adjust a dial. He waited, listened, waited again. When he finally spoke, it was only to acknowledge another message. Routine. Unrelated. The missing confirmation was not mentioned. but I felt it land in my chest like a dropped weight. Later, a runner passed me going the opposite direction. His face was pale under the grime. His eyes avoided mine, not out of secrecy, but because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound wrong. The night deepened. Somewhere beyond the edge of the compound, something had begun, not loudly, not all at once, but enough that the structure we had built our certainty was already being tested. I stood outside for a moment longer than I was supposed to, breathing in the cold, trying to anchor myself to the physical world, the smell of fuel, the crunch of frozen ground, the distant sound of an engine fading into. I realized then that my fear from earlier had been accurate, but incomplete. The decision had not created, it had created alignment, and alignment, once achieved, moved faster than doubt ever could. I went inside when my presence outside became noticeable. The door closed behind me, sealing in warmth, sealing out whatever had begun to unfold. But the sense of movement did not stop. It traveled inward, into memory, into the understanding that nothing I had witnessed would end cleanly, or quickly, or with a moment anyone would later recognize as the turning point. This was the aftermath, not explosion, not collapse, but drift. The quiet, irreversible drift away from the last moment when stopping had still been possible. I did not think about it at first. That is what I tell myself now, and it is mostly true. In the days that followed, there was too much motion to allow reflection. Tasks arrived one after another, each one small, reasonable, self-contained. There was always something to carry, somewhere to stand, someone waiting for a response that had already been decided elsewhere. Memory needs stillness to form. We were given none. When I did sleep, it came without rest. My body shut down, but my mind stayed alert, hovering just below waking. Sounds from the compound slipped into my dreams unchanged. The cough of an engine, the scrape of boots, the clipped cadence of voices through walls. I woke with my jaw tight and my hands curled, as if I had been holding something all night and was afraid of dropping it. The decision was never mentioned again, not directly, not as a single moment anyone pointed to and acknowledged. It dissolved into language, into phrases like "as discussed," "per earlier direction," "already in motion." The absence of reference became its own confirmation. You don't repeat what everyone has agreed not to examine. Information arrived unevenly. Some things I learned only by noticing what stopped happening. Routes that were no longer used. Names that disappeared from rotation. A familiarity that drained out of certain routines, replaced by something colder and more careful. Once, much later, I overheard two men talking quietly near the mess hall. They weren't discussing events, only logistics, but one of them paused mid-sentence and said, almost to himself, "This wasn't how it was supposed to go." The other man did not respond. He stirred his coffee until it spilled slightly over the rim, then wiped it away with his sleeve. That was all. The first real distance came with time. Weeks passed. Then months. The war, whatever name it would later be given by people who hadn't been there, continued to rearrange itself. New pressures replaced old ones. New decisions demanded attention. The one I had witnessed sank deeper, buried under necessity and repetition. But it never left. It stayed with me in small, involuntary ways. In the way my attention sharpened when rooms fell quiet. In the way my stomach tightened whenever a sentence began with, "We have to." In the way I learned to read pauses more carefully than words. I left that place eventually. Most of us did. Assignments ended. Units shifted. The structures that had once felt permanent proved as temporary as everything else built under urgency. I carried no documents with me when I went. No proof, no authority, just memory. At first, I thought memory would fade. That distance would soften it, turn it into a story with edges worn smooth by repetition. That it would become something I could tell, if not proudly, then at least coherently. It did not. The memory resisted language. Every time I tried to shape it into a narrative, this happened, then that. It slipped away from sequence. What remained was not a timeline, but a sensation, a pressure behind the eye, the sound of a pen clicking open, the way a room can accept something terrible without raising its voice. Years later, long after the uniforms had been folded away, I found myself standing in a quiet public place. A station, a hall, somewhere designed for waiting. A clock ticked overhead. People sat nearby, absorbed in their own thoughts. For a moment, the alignment of it all, the stillness, the expectation, the unspoken agreement to proceed, pulled me back without warning. I felt the same internal drop, the same understanding, that there are moments when history turns not because of chaos, but because of calm, because a room full of capable people decides that resistance would be inconvenient, because silence feels safer than objection, because everyone assumes someone else carries the responsibility. I have often wondered what would have happened if I had spoken. Not because I believe it would have changed anything. I don't. The structure was already set. The words were already waiting to be said. I wonder because silence leaves no record of itself. There is no document that shows where doubt was swallowed. No transcript that captures the moment awareness went unused. No line that reads, "Someone present understood what others didn't, and chose not to interrupt." All I have is the knowledge of when I knew, the precise moment understanding arrived before permission did. That is what stays with me. Not the outcome, not the aftermath in all its complexity, but that narrow window where recognition existed without power. A moment when the future was visible and untouchable. And the certainty that in that room, long before anything irreversible happened outside those walls, it had already happened inside us. Quietly, completely, without anyone needing to say so.